Joining us now is Karen Young. She's a senior research scholar at Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy and a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. And Karen, there's a lot to talk about. Eager to talk to you about oil and gas, the broader region. But let's start with this issue if we could. I'm very curious sort of how you watch this conversation unfolding. Yes, the initial proposal there from the president that he would help Saudi Arabia with its civilian nuclear program. And then this turn that we saw a little bit later in the week, that there was this very important caveat that he was placing on that agreement.
That's right. It's been full of surprises, and this is typical Trump in some ways. Post hoc, changing the terms of the deal or creating some arm twisting to sweeten the deal. Normalization, as far as we know, has never been part of the Saudi nuclear agreement with the United States. And this agreement is something that's been in the works, part of negotiations in the Biden administration and in the Trump administration, and had really been sitting very much completed since the end of last year. So, it raises questions like why the announcement now, and then why the kind of turnabout after it was announced, and putting this sort of onus on Secretary Wright that perhaps the terms weren't what the White House wanted. It creates a sense of chaos, frankly.
I know this deal has been around for a while, like you mentioned, but I don't know if it has been around. Has it always been around in this form? Obviously, the controversial bit of this deal is the fuel and whether or not that's going to be enriched in Saudi Arabia and what the limitations on that will be, whether it be some form of a black box system that the U.S. controls. Was that always part of the deal, or at some point did this deal look a lot more like what the U.S. entered into with the UAE in 2009, which is considered the gold standard of these arrangements, where they have nothing to do with the fuel, there's no capacity for enrichment, it is a purely civilian nuclear program?
Well, we have to see the actual language, and it hasn't been released. But in general terms, Saudi Arabia has wanted to reserve the right for enrichment into the future, simply because they have large supplies domestically of uranium, and they wanted to be able to have the capacity to use what they have at home. This is still a 1, 2, 3 agreement, and those are the agreements that the U.S. government makes with other governments to share nuclear technology. So it's similar to the one that was signed and is in place with the United Arab Emirates. But supposedly there's a bit of difference in terms of the kind of 10-year review period for enrichment, for the fuel cycle, and also a bit different in terms of the standard for the IAEA inspections. And so those are the two kind of points that perhaps are in language are different from previous agreements in the region.
I want to play some sound here from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He was at the ASEAN conference a little bit earlier this week talking about the prospects for there being some sort of diplomatic solution to the impasse that we see in the Middle East. Let's take a listen to what he had to say just about the administration's approach to that currently.
These people who are calling us every day begging, let's do a deal, they send us messages through other countries, third countries. They're running out of countries to send. Even I had countries here coming up to me, I just spoke to the Iranians, they want to do a deal. The problem is, every time these people do a deal, they either break it or after they make it, they want to change the deal. So they're probably not ready to do a deal yet, but they will be soon.
Karen, I want to get your sense of sort of where we are in this. I heard you in conversation on a podcast a few weeks back talking about the volatility that we've been having and are likely to expect here in the months ahead. But we have seen, obviously, that MOU not being worth the paper that it was printed on. We've seen the ceasefire dissolve here in recent days. As you listen to the Secretary of State talking about the Iranian appetite for there being a deal, you hear the president saying they want a deal, but we're not there yet. How do you see all of this unfolding? What is going to be the forcing mechanism, do you think, that's going to bring both of these parties back to the table, if they in fact do?
So, as I have said, we should expect volatility for some time. We're not seeing any kind of restoration of 100% pre-February 28th traffic in the Strait of Hormuz, and we might not ever. We're going to get the diversions. We're going to rely on those more, and it's just going to be a long time coming. But, the idea that we could get a settled agreement with Iran is probably going to be kicked down the road, I would imagine. Simply because the U.S. and others still expect that we are creating change inside of Iran, and that the deal makers themselves might be different in the months to come. Now, what's interesting, the signal that I think you mentioned at the outset of the program, is that last night we did not see strikes on Iran or retaliations by Iran on the region. And so we have expected, we've entered this kind of what some call the third and final push of the conflict, Trump making an effort to really go hard on Iran. I think that will probably persist another week or so. And the president sometimes changes his mind. What the military has been in place to do, he may back down. And we don't know, and many would argue that increased military pressure on Iran doesn't necessarily change their calculus. It just sort of reinforces their own bargaining positions and their willingness to sustain more damage.
I mean, the one thing I think everyone learned from this conflict is that it's not just the nuclear card Iran can play. It is that they can now close the Strait at will, which is almost even a more of immediate effect on the global economy. So we've seen a lot of these producers and talks of ramping up ways to get that oil out a different way, out through these pipelines through the Red Sea. What we were talking to our colleague in Singapore, Stephen Szybczynski, about earlier is that you now have the Houthis kind of revving up and starting to strike Saudi Arabia. They claim that they hit Saudi with some missiles last night. And I'm wondering, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked him. It seems to me there's two issues here. There's conflict and danger at the actual export point in the Red Sea. And then there is the danger to production if the Houthis start being able to target refineries and oil producing facilities inside Saudi. Which of those are they both a threat? And what are the big concerns here, especially for the global energy market?
The Houthis are absolutely a concern, and this has always been an issue. To what extent are the Houthis a proxy of Iran? To what extent are they making their own decisions and having their own kind of side negotiations with Saudi Arabia? And they had been in a truce for several years, and Saudi Arabia had been paying, for example, the public sector salaries of the Yemeni government in order to sort of keep some of that peace in place. So the attacks on Jazan are very serious. Threats, of course, to Yanbu are very, very serious because, what has basically been the relief valve from the Strait of Hormuz has been Saudi exports through the East-West pipeline, which are exported at Yanbu and then go through the Bab el-Mandeb. That's going to be about 5 million barrels a day of exports that we would see in danger. So the Houthis have a card there, but they also have their own agency. And so I would expect that Saudi Arabia is going to enter into negotiations with them as quickly as possible and try to calm this down. And the Houthis can be placated and not directly in all forms, controlled by Iran, though they do certainly rely on Iran for support and certainly military supplies.
Karen, we saw oil creep up again this week over $100 a barrel, and I had a number of conversations last week at the Aspen Security Forum with Megan O'Sullivan and Fatih Birol about global complacency as this war got underway, and we've heard the president say time and time again, look, I heard as I considered launching these strikes, oil could get to $200 a barrel, say, and lo, it didn't. And I think with that is born this level of complacency that maybe this didn't have the ramifications that a lot of people feared. Are you of the camp that believes that if this war continues in the way in which it seems it is, there are going to be dramatic spikes? There's going to be a lot more difficulty here. We've seen reserves drawn down and we haven't seen them replenished. Sort of, how do you see this playing out over the next 6 to 12 months if status quo doesn't change?
That's right. I see continued volatility. It doesn't necessarily mean $200 a barrel, but this is really contingent on a couple of things. Chinese demand, for one. We've seen a reduction of about 4 million barrels a day not, being used or wanted in China. When and how that rebounds will really matter a lot. And the second thing is the inventory question. So we've drawn down quite a bit. Can we do that 1, 2, 3 more times? Probably not. So if we get a real obstruction in the Strait of Hormuz and in the Bab el-Mandeb, we're going to have to rely on inventory releases. If that's a 1-month closure, maybe that's a 200 million barrel release needed again. If that's 2 or 3 months, it's probably twice that. That's analysis by JP Morgan. It's not really clear that we have sort of the international will to do so or the capacity to do so. So we could still see by the end of this year, certainly temporary spikes in prices well above $100. And then, if we see easement of shipments happening again. What made June so interesting and why we saw this rush of flow, a lot of that was, cargoes that were laden, sitting in the Gulf, ready to go out and sit in the waters outside of China, about 120 million barrels of oil. That's not going to happen again either. So, the relief that we saw in the middle of the summer when the MOU was in place, yeah. It's hard to imagine that we get to even another temporary agreement with Iran where you would see the same relief to oil markets.